She put a lock on the pantry in the house Margaret Whitmore had paid off 21 years ago. That was the sentence that kept repeating in Margaret's mind as she stood in the kitchen, one hand still resting on the grocery bag she had just carried in from the driveway. The late afternoon sun was falling through the window above the sink, warm and golden, touching the white cabinets, the bowl of lemons on the counter, and the neat row of labeled jars inside the glass front cupboard. Everything looked exactly as it had looked the day before, except for the pantry door. A brand new silver padlock hung there, bright and cold, like a stranger had walked into the house and nailed a warning to her chest. For a long moment Margaret simply stared at it. At 72, she had lived through funerals, hospital waiting rooms, layoffs, broken promises, and the slow, lonely quiet that followed her husband's death. But nothing had prepared her for the humiliation of seeing a lock on her own pantry door, installed not by a thief, not by a landlord, not by a bank, but by her daughter-in-law. She heard footsteps behind her before she turned around. Lauren came in wearing crisp beige slacks and a fitted sweater that still had a department store crease on the sleeve, holding her phone in one hand and a glass bottle of sparkling water in the other. She looked at Margaret, then at the pantry, and gave the faintest shrug, as if she were acknowledging a minor decorating choice. Margaret asked very quietly what that was. Lauren answered with a calm that made it worse. She said the household needed more structure. She said groceries had become expensive. She said some people had old habits of overbuying and overusing things. She said it would help everyone if kitchen access were better managed. Better managed. Margaret felt the words settle in her chest like stones. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not thoughtlessness. This was a decision. A line had been drawn inside her own home, and Lauren had drawn it without permission. Margaret set the grocery bag on the counter and slowly unpacked it anyway. A loaf of wheat bread, a carton of eggs, a half-gallon of milk, a bunch of celery, 2 cans of tomato soup, and the tea she liked in the evenings. She placed each item down with care because care was the only dignity left to her in that moment. Daniel was not home yet, which somehow made it both easier and more painful. Easier because there was no audience for her humiliation. More painful because she already knew he would come in tired from work, loosen his tie, avoid eye contact, and ask everyone to calm down, as though peace could still be bought at a discount after respect had already been sold off. Lauren went on talking, filling the kitchen with a thin managerial tone, explaining how she had made a pantry list and a usage schedule, and how certain snacks and dry goods would now be portioned for the week. Margaret looked at the young woman standing in her kitchen, and thought how astonishing it was that cruelty could arrive wearing pearl earrings and sensible shoes. Lauren was not yelling. She was not rude in the loud, obvious way. That would have been easier to answer. No, Lauren's cruelty was polished. It came wrapped in practical language and a smile that never reached her eyes. Margaret asked where the pantry key was. Lauren took a sip of water and said she would keep it for now, just until everyone adjusted. That was the moment something old and steady in Margaret shifted. Not broke. Shifted. Because a woman like Margaret Whitmore had not spent 40 years stretching paychecks, raising a son, nursing a husband through chemo, and keeping one modest Ohio house warm through every winter only to be treated like a guest who needed supervision around crackers and canned peaches. Still, she did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She nodded once as if Lauren had explained the weather, then picked up the bread and slid it into the bread box. Outside, a car door shut in the driveway. Daniel was home. Margaret looked once more at the lock on the pantry, at the cheap gleam of it in the evening light, and something colder than anger settled into place. Lauren thought that lock meant control. She thought it proved Margaret had finally become small enough to manage. But Margaret had learned something by surviving loss. The quietest women were often the ones people should fear disappointing. And before the next sunrise touched the kitchen floor, that lock would be gone. Daniel came through the back door at 6:23, loosened his tie, and paused just long enough to notice the change in the kitchen before deciding not to notice it at all. Margaret had seen that look before over the years, the quick flick of the eyes, the tiny hesitation, the silent calculation that always chose convenience over courage. He kissed Lauren on the cheek, set his car keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, and asked what smelled good, as if the evening were ordinary and nothing in the room had shifted. Lauren answered for both of them. She said she had reorganized the pantry and put some new rules in place. She said it in the same tone someone might use to announce fresh hand towels in the guest bath. Daniel glanced toward the locked door, then toward his mother, and gave the weak little nod of a man already bracing himself to disappoint someone. Margaret did not help him. She stood at the stove, stirring the tomato soup she had planned to stretch into dinner, and said nothing. Silence, she had learned, often forced people to reveal more than argument ever could. Lauren filled the silence almost immediately. She began explaining the household budget, the waste she had noticed, the importance of boundaries, the need for everyone to be on the same page. Margaret listened without looking at her. The words came one after another, neat and bloodless, but beneath them was the same insult wearing different clothes. This house could be managed better if Margaret would stop behaving like it belonged to her. Daniel finally cleared his throat and said maybe everyone should just sit down and talk. Margaret almost laughed at that. Talk. As though the time for talking had not passed the moment Lauren had purchased a lock, threaded it through the pantry handles, and pocketed the only key. She set 3 bowls on the table, 3 spoons beside them, and a plate of buttered toast in the middle. Even then, habit made her serve them before herself. Even then, some old part of her still moved like a hostess in the home she had built a lifetime around. They ate with the kind of forced politeness that made every spoonful taste thin. Lauren complimented the soup, then mentioned that sodium should probably be monitored more carefully in a shared household. Daniel asked about a report at work. Margaret answered when spoken to, but only barely. She watched them instead. Lauren sat with one ankle crossed over the other, relaxed, almost pleased. Daniel kept dabbing the corner of his mouth with his napkin, a sure sign that guilt was pressing against his ribs. After dinner, Margaret reached automatically for the box of herbal tea bags she usually kept on the second pantry shelf, then stopped herself when her hand met the locked door. Lauren saw it and stood up too quickly, all helpfulness. She said if Margaret needed anything from in there she could ask. Ask. That was the word that stayed with Margaret. Not tell. Not decide. Ask. At 72 years old, in the kitchen where she had packed school lunches, iced birthday cakes, and cooked casseroles for church families after funerals, she was now expected to request permission for her own tea. Margaret turned toward Lauren slowly enough to make the younger woman shift where she stood. She said no thank you, then opened the cabinet above the microwave and took down an old tin of chamomile she had forgotten she still had. That tiny motion brought her more satisfaction than it should have. It reminded her that control often began in the mind long before it returned to the room. Later, when the dishes were done and Daniel had drifted into the den with the television on low, Margaret went upstairs to her bedroom and closed the door. The room was just as Harold had left it in spirit, though it had been 5 years since she had heard his slippers on the hall floor. His photograph still stood on the dresser in a dark wooden frame, his expression steady and kind, as if he had known all along that one day she would need to remember who she had been before other people began testing her edges. Margaret sat on the side of the bed and took off her earrings, placing them carefully into the small porcelain dish from Savannah that she and Harold had bought on their 40th anniversary trip. Downstairs she could hear the television, then Lauren laughing softly at something on her phone. The sound carried through the house in a way that felt almost intimate, as though the younger woman had already begun to treat the walls as her own. Margaret looked around the bedroom, at the quilt she had sewn herself, at the cedar chest, at the curtains she had hemmed by hand, at the house tax statements filed in the bottom drawer of her desk, and she felt humiliation harden into something cleaner. This was no longer about groceries. It was about permission and who believed they had the right to grant it. She stood, walked to the closet, and reached to the back corner where Harold's old metal toolbox still rested on the shelf exactly where he had left it. When she lifted it down, the weight surprised her for only a second. Then she set it on the floor, opened the lid, and ran her fingers over the cool handles of the tools inside. Downstairs, Lauren still believed the evening had ended in her favor. Margaret closed the toolbox, slid it beneath the bed where it would be waiting before dawn, and turned off the lamp with the calm certainty of a woman who had finally decided that silence and surrender were not the same thing. Margaret woke at 4:48, not because the alarm had gone off, but because her body had already decided the hour mattered. The house was still dark, wrapped in that deep blue quiet that came just before dawn, when even the refrigerator hum sounded respectful. For a moment she lay still beneath the quilt, listening. No footsteps upstairs from Daniel and Lauren. No running water. No television from the den. Just the old furnace clicking on and the faraway sound of a delivery truck somewhere on the main road. She turned on the bedside lamp, slipped her feet into her slippers, and sat up with the steady calm of someone who had spent the entire night becoming certain. The toolbox was still beneath the bed where she had left it. She pulled it out, set it on the rug and lifted it with both hands. It was heavier than she remembered, but then again most things were when they carried memory along with metal. She dressed carefully in a navy cardigan, slacks, and the pearl studs she wore when she wanted to remind herself that composure was a kind of armor. Then she walked downstairs one slow step at a time, carrying the toolbox in one hand and her reading glasses in the other. The kitchen greeted her exactly as she had expected. Clean counters, folded dish towel by the sink, coffee maker. Dark and waiting, and the silver lock still hanging from the pantry handles like a smirk frozen in hardware. Margaret set the toolbox on the table and stood there for a long second, looking at the thing in silence. It occurred to her that people like Lauren always relied on the same weakness in others. They believed embarrassment would do their work for them. They believed that once a boundary had been crossed boldly enough, decent people would feel too awkward to push back. But Margaret had been a decent woman for most of her life, and she had finally learned that decency did not require surrender. She opened the toolbox and found what she needed in less than a minute. Harold had kept everything in order, each tool returned to its place with a care that once made Daniel joke his father loved that box more than he loved the garage. Margaret smiled faintly at the memory, then set the screwdriver against the new plate hardware Lauren had added beside the pantry latch. Her hands were not as fast as they had once been, but they were steady. Very steady. She worked slowly, careful not to make more noise than necessary, loosening one screw, then the next until the tension in the metal shifted. The sound was small, almost delicate, no louder than a spoon touching china. Within a few minutes the bracket gave way in her hand. She removed the lock, set it gently on the table, and looked at the pantry doors now resting plain and unguarded in front of her. The sight brought no triumph at first. Only relief. A room in her own home had been restored to itself. Margaret opened the doors and reached for the canister of chamomile tea, then for the oats, then for the jar of rice. She did not need any of those things in that moment. She only needed the proof of access, the quiet reassurance that what belonged to her could still be touched without permission. Then she closed the pantry and turned to the small notepad near the phone stand by the wall. Her pen hovered for only a second before the words arrived clear and hard. If you need permission to touch what is mine, remember whose name is on the deed. She read it once, folded the page in half and placed it on the kitchen table beside the padlock. Not hidden. Not dramatic. Merely visible. Then she started the coffee maker, spooned grounds into the filter, and waited for the first dark drops to fill the glass carafe. Outside, dawn began to loosen the darkness at the edges of the yard. A pale band of light stretched over the bare maple tree beyond the back porch, and the kitchen slowly took on color again. Margaret poured herself a cup, added a little cream, and sat down at the table as if this were any other morning in any other week. The lock remained in front of her, harmless now, reduced to an object instead of a declaration. She took one sip, then another, and let the warmth settle through her. Upstairs she heard movement at last. A floorboard creaked. A bedroom door opened. Water ran briefly in the hall bathroom. Margaret set down her cup and folded her hands in her lap. By the time Lauren walked into the kitchen and saw the table, the note, and the open pantry doors, Margaret Whitmore looked less like an old woman who had been cornered and more like the rightful owner of the morning. Lauren stopped in the kitchen doorway so abruptly that the hem of her robe swung against her calves. For one suspended second she said nothing at all. Her eyes moved from the open pantry to the silver lock on the table, then to the folded note beside it, and finally to Margaret, who was seated calmly with both hands wrapped around her coffee cup as if the morning had begun exactly as it should. The silence did not last long. Lauren crossed the tile in quick, sharp steps, snatched up the note, and read it once with a tightening jaw. Then she read it again, slower this time, as though the words had somehow become more offensive by remaining the same. Margaret watched without expression. She had learned that when people expected a scene, the most unsettling response was often composure. Lauren asked who had done this, but the question had no weight because they both knew the answer. Margaret took another sip of coffee and told her there was no reason to pretend confusion before breakfast. That was when Daniel came down the stairs, still in the gray t-shirt he slept in, hair rumpled, one sock half turned at the ankle. He stepped into the room carrying the heavy sleep of a man who had not yet chosen a side for the day, and then he saw the lock. His face changed in stages: surprise, discomfort, recognition, then the familiar retreat into helplessness. Lauren held up the note and asked if he saw what his mother had done. Daniel looked at Margaret, then at the pantry, then back at his wife. He asked what happened, but his voice already carried that pleading softness that always meant he hoped facts might somehow rearrange themselves into something easy. Margaret set down her cup and told him exactly what had happened. She said an object that did not belong in her kitchen had been removed before sunrise. She said no one would be rationing her food or requiring her to ask permission in her own home. She said it plainly with no drama, and that plainness made every word land harder. Lauren gave a short laugh that did not sound amused. She said this was not about ownership, it was about respect and boundaries and making the household function better. Margaret looked at her for a long moment and asked which part of putting restrictions on another woman's pantry was supposed to represent respect. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck and tried to step in, saying everyone needed to lower the temperature. Margaret almost admired the phrase for its uselessness. Nothing in that room was overheated except Lauren's pride. The morning was cool, the coffee was fresh, and the issue was very simple. Lauren had acted like authority she did not possess. Margaret had corrected the misunderstanding. Lauren set the note back on the table as though touching it too long might burn her fingers. She said if Margaret was going to live with them, there had to be some structure. That sentence changed the room. Margaret did not move immediately, but when she did, it was only to straighten in her chair and fold her hands together more neatly in her lap. Live with them. The words hung in the kitchen like something sour. Daniel closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, which told Margaret he had heard it too and knew there was no defending it. This was not their house. They were the ones living under her roof. Lauren knew that. Daniel knew that. But somewhere in the comfort of being allowed to stay, they had begun rewriting the truth into something easier for themselves. Something where Margaret was no longer the center of the house, but a leftover presence at its edge. Margaret asked Lauren to repeat what she had just said. Lauren did, though with less confidence this time. Margaret nodded once, slow and precise, as if a final piece had just slid into place. She stood, carried her coffee cup to the sink, rinsed it, and set it carefully on the drying mat. The movement was so ordinary that both Lauren and Daniel went quiet watching her. Then Margaret turned around and leaned lightly against the counter. She said she had spent 5 years being generous after Harold died. She had opened the house because Daniel said they needed time to save for a place of their own. She had paid the utilities for longer than planned because life was expensive and family was family. She had tolerated small changes then larger ones, and had said very little because she understood what struggle looked like. But generosity and surrender were not the same thing, and somewhere along the line, that distinction had been lost by everyone except her. Daniel started to speak, but Margaret lifted one hand, not angrily, just enough to stop him. She told him he would have a chance to speak later. For the moment, she wanted both of them to understand that the morning was not the beginning of an argument. It was the end of a misunderstanding. No locks would be placed on any door inside that house again. No one would monitor what she ate when she cooked or what shelf she opened. And no one would refer to her as though she were a dependent being accommodated out of kindness. Lauren's face had turned a careful shade of pale, the kind that came when certainty met a wall it had not expected. Daniel looked as though he wished he could disappear into the floorboards. Margaret let the quiet stretch just long enough to make them feel it. Then she glanced toward the hall closet, where the folder of household papers had been kept for years, and she said there were a few things they were all going to review that evening after dinner, because it was time everyone in that house remembered exactly whose name had been carrying everything all along. The house remained unusually quiet for the rest of the morning, but it was not the peaceful kind of quiet Margaret had once loved. It was the strained, listening kind, the kind that collected in corners and around doorframes when people realized the balance of a household had shifted, and no one yet knew what would happen next. Lauren moved through the kitchen with tight, efficient gestures, opening cabinets more firmly than necessary, setting down a mug with just enough force to announce displeasure, But she did not say another word to Margaret before leaving for work. Daniel lingered after she was gone, standing near the sink with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup he had barely touched. He looked older in that moment than Margaret had seen him in years, not because of gray at his temples or the lines beginning around his eyes, but because guilt had finally taken shape on his face. He asked his mother if she really meant what she said about reviewing everything that evening. Margaret told him she did. He asked whether it had to become that serious. Margaret answered that it had already become serious the moment a woman who did not own the house decided she had the authority to control who could reach a shelf inside it. Daniel lowered his eyes, and for a moment she saw the boy he had once been, the one who used to come home from elementary school with grass stains on his jeans and tears in his eyes whenever someone at recess had been treated unfairly. Somewhere between then and now, that boy had become a man who could recognize wrong and still stand beside it if doing so made his life easier. Margaret did not say that aloud. There was no need. The truth was already doing its work. After he left for the office, the house became hers again for the first time in months, and the difference was so immediate it almost made her ache. She opened the pantry without thinking, took out flour, sugar, and a can of peaches, and set them on the counter just because she could. Then she made herself a small peach cobbler in the square ceramic dish Harold had always preferred, the one with the faded blue handles. The familiar motion settled her. Measuring, stirring, wiping the edge of the bowl with her thumb, all of it reminded her that home was not just a place where bills got paid. It was a rhythm, a set of habits built over decades, a private language of ordinary things. And lately Lauren had been trying to rewrite that language line by line. As the cobbler baked, Margaret went to the hall closet and took down the file box she had mentioned. Inside were folders arranged with the same care she had once used for Daniel's school forms and Harold's insurance papers. Property tax statements, utility bills, repair receipts, the deed, copies of bank transfers Daniel had promised to reimburse and never had. Even the original note from 2 years earlier, written in Daniel's own hand, thanking her for letting them stay for 6 months while they got back on their feet. 6 months had quietly become 23. Margaret sat at the dining room table and spread the papers out in neat stacks. The facts were almost soothing. Facts did not sigh, manipulate, or rewrite history. They stayed where they were put. Around noon, her friend Evelyn called to ask whether she was still coming to church supper on Thursday, and Margaret nearly said yes automatically. Instead, she found herself telling Evelyn more than she had planned, though not everything. Just enough to hear another woman inhale sharply on the other end of the line and say, "Margaret, that is your house." The words were simple, but hearing them from someone else steadied something inside her. By late afternoon the cobbler had cooled, the papers were sorted, and the kitchen smelled of cinnamon and butter. Margaret changed into a fresh blouse and set the dining table with the same deliberate care she might have used for a holiday meal. 3 plates, 3 water glasses, 3 cloth napkins. No one looking at the table would have known it had been prepared for a reckoning. That, she decided, was exactly right. When Lauren's car finally pulled into the driveway just after 5:30, Margaret did not rush to the window. She only folded Daniel's handwritten note once more and placed it on top of the stack beside the deed. Then she rested her fingers lightly on the papers and listened to the front door open, to heels crossing the foyer, to Daniel's lower voice greeting his wife. For the first time in a long while she did not feel cornered in her own home. She felt ready. And when they both stepped into the dining room and saw the neatly ordered documents waiting beneath the soft yellow light, Lauren's expression changed in a way that told Margaret the younger woman had finally understood something important. The pantry had never been the whole battle. It had merely been the moment Margaret stopped allowing herself to be managed. Lauren was the first to recover. She stepped farther into the dining room, set her handbag on the sideboard, and let her gaze move across the table with a look that tried very hard to appear unimpressed. Daniel came in just behind her and stopped when he saw the paperwork arranged in careful stacks under the chandelier. The deed sat at the center. The utility bills were to one side. Receipts, tax statements, and printed bank transfers were lined up with the kind of precision that only came from someone who had spent a lifetime holding a household together, when other people barely noticed the effort. Margaret remained seated at the head of the table, hands folded, posture straight, her expression calm enough to make the room feel even tighter. No one reached for a chair right away. Lauren asked what all of this was supposed to prove. Margaret answered that nothing at the table needed proving. It only needed reading. Daniel gave a tired exhale and pulled out a chair, then looked at Lauren as if hoping she would do the same. She sat, but not because she wanted to. She sat because standing there any longer would have looked childish, and even Lauren knew that. Margaret slid the top page forward. It was the deed, her name printed clearly where it had always been, unchanged by marriage, unchanged by grief, unchanged by the quiet arrogance of younger people mistaking patience for weakness. She let them both look at it before speaking. Then she reminded Daniel of the timeline he had once asked her to accept. 6 months, he had said. Just 6 months while they saved for a place, got stable again, and figured out the next step. Margaret placed his handwritten note beside the deed. The date on it was nearly 2 years old. Daniel did not touch it. He only stared, as though seeing his own handwriting had become unexpectedly difficult. Lauren said living arrangements evolved. And plans changed. Margaret said plans could change, but gratitude should not. The words landed hard enough that even Daniel looked up. Margaret moved to the second stack and began with the household costs. Electric, gas, water, property taxes, home insurance, a plumbing repair from last winter, furnace servicing in October. She did not rush. She named each expense the way a teacher might recite facts to a room that had become too comfortable with guessing. Then she showed them the transfers Daniel had made during the first few months, followed by the long stretch where those payments became smaller, later, and then vanished entirely. Lauren's mouth tightened when the numbers stopped favoring her version of events. She said she contributed in other ways. She said she bought groceries, cleaned the bathrooms, handled laundry, managed routines, and made the home run more efficiently than before. Margaret listened and let the younger woman finish. Then she said efficiency did not grant ownership. Washing towels did not give anyone authority over another woman's shelves, locks, or dignity. Daniel pressed his fingertips against his forehead. He asked whether they could all please talk about solutions instead of accusations. Margaret almost smiled at that, because solutions had suddenly become urgent only now that the paperwork was in front of them. For months, no one had hurried toward solutions while she was being slowly pushed aside. Lauren said she had only been trying to create order because the household felt chaotic. Margaret asked what part of the household had seemed chaotic to her. The bills being paid on time, the roof over their heads, the groceries stocked, the kitchen maintained, the laundry machine still working because Margaret had paid to replace the hoses last spring. Lauren looked away first. It was a small thing, but Margaret noticed. Daniel asked quietly whether this was really all about the pantry. Margaret answered with more softness than either of them deserved. She said it had never been about one door. It was about the thinking behind the door. It was about the moment someone began believing she had the right to reduce the owner of the home into a person who needed permission. She said that once, then let the silence do the rest. The room held still around them. Even the clock on the wall seemed suddenly too loud. Lauren tried one more time to reclaim ground. She said if boundaries were going to be discussed, then everyone should be honest about how difficult shared living could be. She said older people often resisted change, and sometimes practical measures were mistaken for disrespect. Margaret leaned back slightly and studied her. The sentence was polished, almost elegant, but underneath it was the same ugly thing she had heard from the beginning. Control disguised as concern. Condescension disguised as management. Margaret placed both palms lightly on the edge of the table, and told Lauren that age had nothing to do with what was happening in that room. Character did. Daniel closed his eyes. Not dramatically. Just long enough to show that the truth had hit him where excuses could no longer cushion it. Margaret turned toward her son then, and her voice changed. It did not become harsher. It became sadder, which was worse. She told him that what hurt most was not Lauren's behavior. Lauren had revealed herself clearly. The deeper wound was watching her own son stand nearby and call it structure when it was disrespect, call it stress when it was entitlement, and call it peacekeeping when it was surrender. Daniel looked at the table like a man who had finally realized there was no harmless place left to rest his eyes. Margaret drew one final folder from the bottom of the stack, and placed it in front of them without opening it. She told them there was one more paper they needed to discuss before the evening was over. And this one would determine whether they left that table as family working toward repair or as houseguests being given a date to move out. Margaret let the unopened folder remain on the table for a moment longer, not because she enjoyed suspense, but because some truths deserved a second of silence before they were heard. Daniel stared at it as though he already understood that whatever sat inside was going to divide the evening into before and after. Lauren folded her arms and leaned back in her chair, still trying to wear the expression of someone who had not been unsettled, but the strain at the corners of her mouth gave her away. Margaret opened the folder with the same measured calm she had used all night and drew out a typed page, crisp and neatly aligned. She placed it flat on the table where both of them could see the heading. It was not a threat, not yet, and not a formal legal filing. It was a written household notice, simple and clear, stating that any continued stay in the home would now require specific conditions. No changes to locks, rooms, or storage without the homeowner's consent, equal monthly contribution paid on the first business day of each month, respectful use of all shared spaces, and a firm move-out deadline within 60 days if those conditions were refused. Daniel read the page twice without speaking. Lauren gave a short, incredulous laugh and asked whether Margaret had seriously typed up house rules like they were children. Margaret answered that children usually needed fewer reminders about respect. The silence after that was sharp enough to make Daniel shift in his seat. Lauren said this was extreme. She said no one could live comfortably under rules like that, and she said it as if comfort had been something Margaret alone was required to preserve. Margaret told her the rules were not designed for comfort. They were designed for clarity. For too long, everyone in that house had benefited from blurred lines except the person paying the price for them. Daniel finally found his voice and said there had to be another way. Margaret turned to him and asked very gently what other way he had in mind. Had he planned to ask his wife to apologize? Had he planned to replace the money he still owed? Had he planned to correct the language that morning when Lauren implied Margaret was the one being accommodated? Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. Margaret did not press. The answer was already there in the empty space where his defense should have been. Lauren reached for the paper and scanned it with growing disbelief. She stopped at the line about the monthly contribution and said they could not afford that amount. Margaret nodded and said that was useful information, because it meant they needed to make serious plans now instead of living indefinitely inside a fantasy that her generosity had no limit. Lauren set the paper down and accused Margaret of punishing them over one disagreement. Margaret corrected her immediately. This was not one disagreement. This was a pattern. It was moving furniture without asking. It was replacing kitchen items Margaret still used because Lauren preferred a different style. It was the thermostat being changed and then denied. It was Daniel promising help with expenses, then forgetting. It was every small act of assumption that slowly transformed welcome into occupation. And above all, it was that lock. Not because of the metal itself, but because it exposed the belief beneath it. Lauren's face flushed. She said she had been trying to make the house more functional, and that older people often became emotional when routines changed. Margaret almost pitied her then, because Lauren still believed age was the weakness in the room. She still had not understood that age was the reason Margaret no longer wasted time pretending disrespect was accidental. Margaret told her that maturity was not measured by how confidently a person rearranged a kitchen. It was measured by whether they could tell the difference between helping and taking over. Daniel leaned forward at last, elbows on the table, and asked what would happen if they signed the notice. Margaret said then they would have 60 days to leave with dignity, enough time to find an apartment, save properly, and close this chapter without turning it uglier than it already was. Lauren looked at him in disbelief, as if she expected him to reject the entire idea on the spot. He did not. That was when the room shifted again. It was subtle but unmistakable. For the first time all evening, Daniel did not rush to protect the comfort of the loudest person in the room. He asked to look at the payment records again. Margaret slid the stack toward him. Lauren stared at her husband with the wounded anger of someone discovering that facts were less loyal than emotion. Daniel looked through the pages slowly, and with every sheet his shoulders seemed to lower another inch. He had known, of course. Maybe not every detail, maybe not every overdue promise, but enough. Enough to have spoken sooner. Enough to have stopped this before it reached a dining table covered in proof. Margaret watched him with an ache she refused to show. There was no victory in being right about your own child. Only sorrow. Lauren stood suddenly and walked to the window, arms folded tight, looking out into the dark yard where the porch light cast a pale circle across the grass. She said she felt ambushed. Margaret answered that an ambush happened without warning. This conversation had been building for months. The only reason it felt sudden was because no one had expected her to stop enduring it. Daniel set the last paper down and looked at the notice again. When he finally raised his eyes to his mother, there was something in them Margaret had not seen in a long time. Not confidence. Not certainty. Just shame stripped clean of excuses. He asked in a quiet voice whether 60 days was truly her final decision, and Margaret told him no. Then she reached into the folder, pulled out one more sheet, and said that depending on what happened in the next 5 minutes, the deadline could become much sooner. Margaret held the final sheet between 2 fingers and laid it on the table with no more force than if she were setting down a church bulletin. But the effect on the room was immediate. Daniel leaned forward. Lauren turned from the window. The page was shorter than the others, and that made it more dangerous. It was a printed summary from Margaret's attorney, prepared the previous spring when Harold's old probate files had been updated, and it stated in plain, careful language that no adult relative residing in the home acquired any ownership interest, occupancy protection, or decision-making authority by living there informally without a lease. Margaret did not need to raise her voice after that. The paper did it for her. Daniel read the first paragraph, then the second, and the color left his face in a slow, visible drain. Lauren walked back to the table, took the page from him, and read it with the stiff concentration of someone trying to outstare a fact she disliked. When she reached the last line, she looked up and asked whether Margaret had gone to a lawyer behind their backs. Margaret answered that she had gone to a lawyer the day she first realized kindness was being mistaken for weakness. She said it without triumph. If anything, there was sadness in it. Years ago, she had imagined that family would be the one place where paperwork would never need to defend what love should have made obvious. But here they were. Lauren said this was manipulative. She said Margaret had clearly been planning to throw them out. Margaret corrected her at once. She had been planning to protect her home. Those were not the same thing, though selfish people often confused them. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face and asked when she had done all this. Margaret said after the thermostat argument in November, after the missing reimbursement in January, and especially after she began noticing that every decision in the house was being rerouted through Lauren's approval, as if the homeowner were somehow the least qualified person in the building. Lauren started to speak, but Margaret raised one hand and continued. She said the document was not there to humiliate anyone. It was there to remove the last illusion in the room. No one at that table had legal standing to manage her property, her pantry, her routines, or her access to her own kitchen. There would be no more pretending that shared inconvenience created shared authority. Daniel stared down at the table for so long that Margaret wondered whether he would say anything at all. At last he asked the question she had been waiting for, though she had not expected it to come out so quietly. He asked whether she had already decided they needed to leave no matter what. Margaret looked at him for a moment before answering. She said she had decided that the house could not continue the way it had been. What happened next would depend on whether the 2 people sitting across from her still knew how to act like family instead of opportunists. The words settled over the room like cold rain. Lauren gave a disbelieving shake of her head and asked what exactly Margaret wanted. An apology. Rent. Control. Margaret almost smiled at the order of that list. It revealed everything. She told Lauren she wanted 3 simple things. First, acknowledgement of what had been done. Second, a clear plan for leaving the house with respect instead of entitlement. Third, no more distortions, no more speeches about boundaries from people who had crossed all of hers. Lauren's mouth parted, then closed again. For the first time since the kitchen that morning, she had no polished language ready. Daniel broke in then, and something in his voice had changed. He said Lauren should apologize. The words were soft, but they landed harder than any raised voice could have. Lauren turned toward him slowly, disbelief sharpening every line of her face. Daniel repeated it. He said she should apologize for the pantry, for the tone she had used, and for speaking as if his mother were the dependent in the house. Margaret did not move. She simply watched. Some moments in a family did not announce themselves as turning points until long after they passed, but this one did. It was visible while it happened. Lauren asked him whether he was seriously siding against his own wife. Daniel answered that this was not about sides anymore. It was about what was true. Margaret felt something inside her loosen then, not enough to become forgiveness, not yet, but enough to become clarity. Daniel had finally chosen honesty over comfort, and honesty came late more often than people admitted. Lauren stood very still beside the table, one hand resting on the chair back, her knuckles pale against the wood. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than Margaret had ever heard it. She said she had only wanted order because living there had made her feel like nothing was ever fully hers. Margaret looked at her and saw, beneath the arrogance, something smaller and harder to respect than anger. Envy. Lauren had not simply wanted efficiency. She had wanted possession. She had wanted to feel like mistress of a house that never belonged to her. Margaret answered gently, almost kindly, that wanting security did not entitle a person to steal authority from someone else. Then she slid the 60-day notice across the table and placed a pen beside it. Daniel looked at Lauren. Lauren looked at the paper. Neither of them touched it. Margaret folded her hands and waited. The clock on the wall ticked through 1 full minute, then another. Finally Daniel reached for the pen. His fingers trembled only slightly as he picked it up, but before the tip touched paper, Lauren said something that made him stop cold and made Margaret realize the real betrayal in that house had never been the lock at all. Lauren said, with a flatness more chilling than anger, that the house should have been Daniel's by now anyway. The words landed in the dining room like a glass dropped on tile, sharp and impossible to ignore. Daniel's hand froze above the paper. Margaret did not speak at first because silence, in that moment, revealed more than any interruption could. Lauren seemed to realize too late that she had finally said the quiet part out loud. Not boundaries. Not groceries. Not household order. The house. That had always been the center of it. The pantry had only been the first corner she tried to claim. Daniel lowered the pen and turned to his wife with a look Margaret had not seen on his face in years. It was not confusion. It was recognition. He asked Lauren what she meant. Lauren drew in a breath and tried to soften it, tried to explain it away with talk of the future, inheritance, practicality, and how families usually planned ahead. But the damage was done. Every polished excuse she had used over the past months suddenly showed its true shape. Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her, deeper even than the one she had carried since dawn. At least now the room was honest. Daniel stood from the table so abruptly that his chair legs scraped the floor. He was not loud, but his voice had a firmness Margaret barely recognized when he asked Lauren whether she had ever encouraged him to stop contributing because one day the house would be his anyway. Lauren looked away, and that tiny motion answered before she did. Daniel asked again. This time she said she had only meant they were family, and that eventually things would work themselves out. Margaret almost closed her eyes then, not from weakness but from the weariness of seeing greed dress itself up as belonging. Daniel took a step back from the table, as though he needed physical distance from what he had just heard. He said, more to himself than anyone else, that this was why every conversation about saving money had somehow ended with another purchase, another delay, another reason they could not move. Margaret watched her son put the years together in real time, watched him trace all the soft manipulations he had ignored because they had been easier than conflict. Lauren tried one last time to reclaim the moment. She said Margaret was turning them against each other. Margaret answered quietly that truth only divided people who were already standing on different sides of it. That was when Daniel did something Margaret had not expected, not even after the apology he had demanded. He picked up the 60-day notice, signed his name at the bottom, and slid it across to Lauren. He told her they were leaving. Not because Margaret was forcing them out, but because he would not spend another day living in a house under false assumptions and borrowed entitlement. Lauren stared at him as though he had become a stranger in front of her. She asked whether he was really choosing his mother over his marriage. Daniel answered that he was choosing decency over denial, and if she could not tell the difference, then that was part of the problem. The room went very still after that. Margaret had imagined many endings to the evening, but not this exact one. There was no pleasure in it, only a sober sense that some debts inside a family were measured in more than dollars. Lauren remained standing for a long moment, then picked up her handbag from the sideboard. Her face had changed. The confidence was gone. In its place was the cold shock of someone realizing a plan had collapsed, because she had finally revealed too much of herself. She said she was going for a drive. Daniel did not stop her. Margaret did not either. The front door opened and closed, and the sound echoed through the house with a finality that felt almost ceremonial. Daniel stayed standing by the table, both palms pressed flat against the wood, head bowed. When he finally looked at Margaret, there were tears in his eyes, though none fell. He said he was sorry. Not the quick, mumbled kind of sorry people offer when they want discomfort to end, but the slow kind that costs something. Sorry for staying silent. Sorry for letting her be diminished. Sorry for not seeing sooner what had been happening right in front of him. Margaret listened, and because she was Margaret, because age had taught her the difference between performance and remorse, she knew he meant it. But meaning it did not erase the hurt. She told him she loved him. Then she told him love did not cancel consequences. He nodded as if he understood that for the first time. They sat in the quiet dining room for another few minutes, the signed paper between them, the house around them feeling both heavier and cleaner. Later that night, after Daniel had gone upstairs to begin packing boxes from the guest room closet, Margaret walked into the kitchen alone. She opened the pantry door and stood there for a moment, looking at the shelves lined with flour, rice tea, canned peaches, and all the ordinary things that had somehow become the setting for a family's truth. She reached in, took down the chamomile tin, and set water to boil. Outside, the porch light cast its familiar circle onto the yard. Inside, the house felt like hers again, not because the paperwork said so, not because anyone had finally admitted it, but because she had remembered it for herself. By the time she carried her tea to the table, the old silver lock was still sitting where she had left it that morning, small and useless in the soft kitchen light. Margaret picked it up, opened the junk drawer, and dropped it in without a second glance. Some things deserved to be kept only as a reminder. And as she stood there in the quiet home she had protected with patience, proof, and one perfectly timed note, Margaret understood that she had not just removed a lock from a pantry door. She had removed her family's last excuse for pretending she was anything less than the woman the house had belonged to all along.